Okay, so from this week, we will discuss about the intertemporal framework. So today, we will have brief overview on the intertemporal framework, and then next session. So this Wednesday, and probably next Monday, we will go more deep inside to explore the life cycle hypothesis. So as I told you before, the intertemporal framework is kind of an overarching framework. So under the intertemporal framework, there are different theories. So for example, the life cycle hypothesis, and the book, the Brian and Zeke book that we are using as a textbook, they introduced some, I think they mentioned about the absolute income hypothesis and the permanent income hypothesis, which is very similar to the life cycle hypothesis. So those are under the intertemporal framework. So we will start discussing about the temporal framework. So from the last topic, it was about the consumer demand theory. So that totally ignores that there exist multiple time periods, right? So we do not consider savings and the borrowings decision, because we are supposed to consume all our income in one period because there is no future, right? But from this week, from this topic, there we know that there exist multiple time periods, and we allocate our resources across the time periods. So they invite the concept of savings and borrowings because there are multiple time periods. Okay. So I think Eric is the presenter of the today. So are you ready for that?
I'm ready. Yep.
Okay, then please share your screen for us.
Okay. Okay, cool. Are you guys seeing the main presentation? Yep. Okay. Okay. So yep, as Dr. Lim introduced, we're going to be talking about the intertemporal framework. I'll do a summary, basically, of chapter 4. We'll get into an application of the theory, which was the paper on effects of the family life cycle stages on consumer debt. I have a little critique section, strengths and limitations, and then I grabbed a couple questions that we can talk about further. So to get started, I thought I'd put this slide on here. We'll keep calm and study the theory. All right, so like Dr. Lim said, so chapter 4 was about consumption and saving, and the main thing is that it adds time. Intertemporal, I Googled like, what does that actually mean? And so it's, you know, the definition is that it's relating to the past, present, and future. So I thought that was just kind of a helpful framework to be thinking about that. It involves consumption and saving. Saving is really two things, saving and borrowing. And the point is to maximize satisfaction, so or utility, whatever you want to call it. And we're allocating present and future expected resources among different time periods over life and trying to smooth out that, I have income stream, but that's not quite right. It's to smooth out the consumption stream. So there's 3 different elements to these models. There's the intertemporal budget constraint, household preferences, and then the idea that we're still trying to maximize our satisfaction. The 3 main models that was in the chapter was the absolute income hypothesis, permanent and life cycle, which we said are pretty much the same thing, with the difference, I believe, being a difference in the bequest motive. And by the way, guys, if you want to fact check me on anything or shoot things into the chat, I'll try to pick those up as well. So the absolute income hypothesis, the main thing here is that as income increases, that spending also increases, but not as a direct one-to-one. That spending is assumed to not increase as much. So that it also kind of leads, I know Chet had a remark in the thing this week about some of these being super obvious comments. This seemed like one of those, that the rich also have a save a higher fraction of current income than the poor. I mean, that kind of seems like that's probably how you got there. But other factors that change the magnitude of saving is income, taxation, credit availability, price changes, and consumer confidence. The strength of this one is that it does explain differences in different time periods, but it talked about that it doesn't predict like the fact that the U.S. nation as a whole has increased incomes over time, and so this doesn't seem to pick up on those changes. So it kind of leads into the permanent and life cycle income hypothesis. The main differences from this compared to absolute is that these two measure income, looking at it in terms of total resources instead of just the current year income, and they also assume that that constant that is a constant ratio of savings to income. I think probably the main thing on here is we sort of just talked about this, but the purpose of this is to even out the variation in income over time to match the consumption demands. The other thing, kind of the big difference between these two, is that whereas the life cycle hypothesis assumes that we're going to leave nothing, the permanent income hypothesis assumes that we're consuming the annual return. And so because of that, it kind of becomes like a perpetuity and we're leaving the remaining assets. The reality is, like the book says, and as we all know, it's somewhere in between there, but at least that's the framework for those. So the life cycle income hypothesis, households prefer to have a constant level of consumption, keep their income to consumption ratios relatively constant. It assumes that as income goes up, savings increase. And some of the implications are that, you know, we expect younger households to have more debt relative to income because they're borrowing to consume at that same level. Then sort of in middle age, we're slowly building up our net worth, and then in retirement, just saving. So it seems to at least match what would make sense empirically. The strengths of the life cycle hypothesis are that income, interest rates, price expectations determine consumption and behavior. Also that it captures that time element, whereas like the neoclassical just sort of assumes that we consume everything immediately. A couple limitations. So there was discussion empirically that the shape of income and consumption was like more of an inverted U shape versus something that was constant. Another study found that they were more of a parallel pattern between those, and some of the drawbacks were like, so why does that happen, or why does it not match up exactly as to what the hypothesis says? Is it doesn't capture the presence of children. So this is kind of getting into what the paper started to talk about. It doesn't consider that like lower income households have liquidity constraints, so they might not be able to borrow even if they want to. That there's inheritance motives, and this is also kind of showed up in that Hannah and you paper too, about the idea of prudence was what they were talking about is your spending compared to your income, like whether you spend more or not. And I forget which paper that had it in there, but they talked about, I think Todd mentioned this in his post too, that it was the bachelor theory of savings because it didn't include family size or consumption. It was just age only. So some other things, you know, that to think about from a limitation standpoint is, you know, the choice of this, I think gets into what the next set of readings are about, is more of like the fact, like I forget which one that's called now, but where the household can basically contribute to producing goods. So that's not taken into account here. Also empirically, how do you measure some of these things? Like how do you measure a time preference and like the future value of your, or the present value of your future income? I don't know that people really make those calculations. Okay, so we'll get into the empirical paper. So as it was applied, so this one was the effects of family life cycle stages on consumer debt in 2004. This one used the 1998 SCF. And again, just trying to apply the life cycle income hypothesis. The purpose, first, they did basically this descriptive statistics to see who was using these different types of consumer debt based on the stage of life that they were in, the life cycle stage. And also they wanted to see how household life cycle stages were related to different types of debt. So the thing that was kind of neat is whereas the hypothesis uses age only, this one added marital status and the presence of children. I have a slide that has all the 8 different ones, but this was a little confusing to me at first because this paper actually was kind of frustrating to review to some extent because it would show like they would have the different hypothesis, but then the way that they actually did the analysis didn't quite match up with what how they stated their hypothesis. So like, for example, they had a hypothesis that a certain type of household would use either type of debt, but the way that they coded the variables is they looked at them separately, which is fine, that makes sense, but it just seems like maybe you would change the way that you would state your hypothesis. So it was kind of 4 different models, one looking whether you have credit card debt or not, an installment debt or not, and then also what the amount of that was. And does anyone remember from the reading or from summer, if we have this binary outcome, what type of model we might run for that?
Logic, right? Yeah. Logic
Yeah,
regression
or probit.
Yeah, it's like
or-
or probit, yeah.
right, and they use probit in this one for the have or have not of these two. And the amounts they use an OLS, which makes sense, but they use kind of this hurdle thing. And again, to Chet's point, one of the readings that it seemed, like when we did this with the NFCS, I remember there was a question about like, I can't remember how that was phrased. Let's just say it was credit card debt. And they have this hurdle model, which is like, first you have to answer that you have a credit card and then what the amount was. Well, it seems like if you have credit card debt, that assumes that you have a credit card. So it didn't quite make sense to me as to why you would put the hurdle in there, but anyways. So the key constructs, so there's the life cycle stage, obviously. There's your ability to borrow, the willingness, prudence, which was this spending versus income variable. And then they also included an expectation about rates. And then need to borrow was really broken down into these different categories. So it looked at financial resources, your education level, employment status, race. And then I thought this was kind of cool. It was like whether or not you have a home equity loan or not, or the ability to borrow from friends, with the idea that, if either one of those were true, then your likelihood of having, like, say, installment debt or something else might be reduced. I thought that was kind of interesting. These were the different life cycle stages. So there was 6, what they sort of called traditional life cycle stages, and then they had 2 non-traditional. Again, I'm trying to remember when the paper was done, but somebody had a good point too, that, hey, if you're going to update this study in today's world, so to speak, would you change these categories? Would you add some? So that was kind of an interesting point we could maybe discuss at the end. I found this nerdy slide that I thought everybody in here would appreciate. It seems like every time you hit go on Stata, that this is kind of what we're all hoping that we get significance. And especially for this case, because there were so many different variables, and a lot of them ended up being not statistically significant. So it was interesting to me to see how they phrased the hypothesis earlier in the paper was basically that they assumed that younger people would have more debt than some of the later life cycles. But then the way that they actually ran the model was they were comparing it all to this young and single reference category. So that's fine. But again, it just seems like if you're going to do that type of analysis, that maybe that hypothesis should match up that way. So anyways, I know we're not necessarily supposed to critique the paper itself in those terms, but I just thought it was interesting, I guess, going through it that way. I'll summarize this, so don't get too caught up on this, but if you want to look at it later, this is kind of the summary. The way that I have this set up is this was the, do you have debt or not? So that's the way that they phrased the hypothesis. They ran two different models though. So like, did you have installment debt versus credit card debt? And then was that supported? So again, how do you really test the hypothesis here if you have either type of debt? I don't know. Anyways, it just seemed a little bit strange. It seems like it would have been more clear if the hypothesis matched the analysis. But anyways, the OLS model then was based on the amount of debt that you had and whether or not it was supported. Basically, in a lot of these, there was only a handful of these life cycles that were statistically significant. So I have this summarized here. The main finding was conceptually, life cycle stages, the willingness to borrow, the need, the ability, and prudence, they did affect the two types of consumer debt. In terms of installment debt, the households that had statistical significance were the empty nest, the solitary household, and the single parent. So those were both less likely to have installment debt, as well as have a lower level of it as compared to the young and single. In terms of credit card, solitary household, single parent, and the childless middle-aged were less likely to have credit card debt. So this is specific to the credit cards. If you kind of combine those together, I thought this was kind of interesting actually reading this at the end that, life cycle does play more of a role in explaining the installment debt versus credit card. And I don't know, I guess I just thought it was kind of cool to see like, yeah, installment debt is more associated with a goal, like, for a car or education, which would change throughout one's life cycle. Whereas credit card debt, you may have that as a 19-year-old versus a 90-year-old, but kind of less of a function of the life cycle. In terms of financial resources, they found that income, financial assets, and non-financial assets had a significant influence on both types of consumer debt, which kind of makes sense. That would reflect both your need to have debt and also your ability. So that, like, the liquidity constraint, sometimes that relationship was negative, sometimes it was positive. The willingness to borrow, they measure that in terms of your attitude towards credit, and that had more of an impact in your decision to borrow or not versus how much, which again, that just sort of makes sense. Like if you're okay with borrowing for certain goals, then you probably at least have it as an option, but it wasn't necessarily determinant on the dollar amount that you were borrowing. So I'll kind of wrap up that with the paper here with just a couple questions. I thought Brandon asked something kind of interesting. I guess he's not, I don't think he's on here right now, but asking about the, did we have research questions that came to mind as we read the literature this week? He had two on there posted, which I thought kind of both related to like delaying gratification. So I'll spin it over to you guys. I'm just curious. And it looks like there's a chat in here too. Oh, that was Brandon. Okay. Cool. So I'll open it up if you guys want to discuss. Were there other research ideas that you guys were thinking of, like maybe how you would apply any of these hypotheses?
I have maybe kind of like a question that I was thinking when you were discussing about the hurdles they used on the article. And I guess maybe we have a similar understanding by how these were used, but they asked whether you have a credit card or not, and then they used the question about how much credit card debt you have. And I'm thinking, what if there are some cases where people do have credit card debt, but they don't have a credit card because they closed the credit card because they had too much credit card debt? And I know people that have done that in their lives, because the more they had a credit card, the more they were piling up the credit card debt. So I don't know, maybe those were excluded from the analysis completely with that hurdle, and was that right or wrong? And
Oh yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I see what you're saying, because I suppose it'd be like, yeah, if you built up the debt, but then no longer have the card, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing with the prudence, when you were talking about prudence and precautionary saving on the theory part, they're talking about precautionary saving at the older age, right? When people are afraid that they're gonna, they'll be sick and they may need, more money for long-term care or whatever that could be if they don't have insurance and stuff. So how does that affect the whole life cycle hypothesis? And instead of, maybe people in older age save instead of save because of that, because they have this increased healthcare expenses that, so yeah, it was discussed in the model that it was not really included in the model. Is that right, Dr. Lim? Like it's not something that the model considers, right? The theory, I don't know. Those were some of my questions on the chat too, on the discussion this week, but there's plenty of research questions from this, and it's like I have a research topic for my class that is similar, and I was thinking, oh, I could apply the life cycle hypothesis. I'm applying another theory because I didn't find a lot of people applying that other theory in this, and I'm trying to include psychological factors into the questions. But it's interesting how you could apply different theories for the same kind of variables and same research question, and maybe reach, I don't know if you can reach the same results or not at the end. But anyway, sorry, I don't know that I'm answering questions or I'm asking too many questions here, but those are my thoughts.
I think the insurance part
Thanks.
that you mentioned too, like in terms of like long-term care, or like that's the thing I kept thinking about, that this model doesn't specifically talk about, but I thought, it's not borrowing per se, but it seems like you're hedging against like dying early by buying life insurance, for example. I just thought anyways that this might be a framework to use for maybe looking at insurance purchases and stuff like that.
I think it'd be interesting to look at something like insurance purchases through the lens of whether it's something like term, where the value from a cash standpoint or from an asset standpoint, the value or the income is destroyed, quote unquote, or we purchase something and it just goes away, versus something that has an accumulating cash value. Because then it's not a spending behavior per se. It's kind of a hybrid of spending and saving, and how that potentially fits into the picture.
How did, like, you guys, especially practitioners, do you view life insurance as an asset?
I do. I account for it almost a little bit as, if there is a bequest motive, I account for that in aggregated asset allocation analysis as a component of a bond portfolio. Just because if you look at permanent insurance specifically, and if there's a bequest motive, that's really in the aggregated asset allocation, that is the sleeve that is, either money market or bond, in my opinion, with that bequest motive. And that then allows you to diversify the remaining asset allocation across more risk-taking assets that might be more appropriate for retirement income objectives, accounting for the bequest motive.
I like that, yeah.
I think it also just is a question of the order of operations and the household composition, right? It's a really strong asset for people with high incomes who've burned up all their other tax shelters. It's more or less valuable depending on how many dependents you have, or if you have a spouse, that sort of thing. But I mean, it absolutely is its own, call it like, I wouldn't call it an asset class, but almost just kind of like a asterisk you'd put next to another asset class. It's in a special tax sleeve, in a special spot for itself.
And not only about insurance, but what Chad was mentioning too on the discussion about assets that are, you know, do you consider spending or partially saving if you're buying an expensive car, for example, you know, that is going to be depreciated over a longer period because it's just, you know, it's a Mercedes versus a Toyota, I don't know, or something. Like, how does the model fit with that? Like those assets that have a longer life.
Yeah, and my follow, I think I commented on your post, Effie, or maybe it was someone else's, but it gets down to, well, okay, maybe we do that, right? Like maybe we collectively as a group decide we're going to calculate that out and figure out if we depreciate it versus not depreciate it. But what's the so what factor in that? I mean, and Dr. Lim, this may be a question for you, is, you know, these types of things where they're looking at this with what they consider consumption, whether it's durable or not durable and all that. I mean, accounting for a durable good that's just considered a consumption, just like groceries, when we're looking from a policy standpoint on saving and the decisions that go along with that from a policy and tax and whatever standpoint. I mean, even if we dialed it in and got super myopic with it, what would that even be used for, do you think? Or would it?
I do not exactly remember, but is there anyone who used the SEF saving questions for your projects before? No?
Like what they were saving for?
No, I mean the saving question itself. So there was a question about whether the
I did.
spending.
I
You
did.
Do you
Yeah,
remember the wordings and how you quoted it?
So the question was about, do you save more than your income or less, more or less, or you spend about what your income is? That's kind of how the question was phrased. And there was a yes, no, or.
Okay, so I am searching.
I can.
Question now, but because there was a wording like whether they have some big expenses in last year, something like that. So they kind of incorporated. So the typical coding for whether the household saved or not was related with the question. So just give me a second. Probably Yoy and Hannah's article used that.
I think they talk about that in the paper. That because if you say that you had purchased a house or something like that in the last year, then they counted that as saving.
Yeah, so if that's the case, if the spending was higher than their income, they did not code the household as the borrowers, okay? Because that big expense is kind of, you know, it could be the investment or it could be some different form of the savings. So when we code the SEF questions for the household saving, we consider that factor. So we see it's not like a pure borrowing or something like that. Okay, follow me. And regarding the question about the insurance, I actually recommend you to think about annuity rather than the life insurance, because that's more aligned to the topic in this week's topic. Because the annuity product, it's designed to provide the life income until you die, right? So that's actually good tools to make your consumption smoothing possible throughout the life cycle, right? So you have annuity product, especially when you do not have self-control, then it's a good tool to make you save while you're working, and then make your spending pattern very consistent throughout your life, right? So think about the annuity product and how it works with the life cycle hypothesis, okay? Because I think the annuity product provides more implications from the life cycle hypothesis point. And there are a bunch of articles from the economic articles about the annuity product and how it goes with the life cycle hypothesis. And also there is issue called the annuity puzzle. So from the economic standing point, annuity is a perfect tool. Everyone should annuitize their wealth because it allows consumption smoothing. Okay, but there are, a lot of opposite cases in the, the annuity product is not popular. There are a bunch of reasons for that, especially in the market, but maybe it's expensive, right? They have a lot of fees, but still people do not prefer annuities, and there are reasons for that. I think that's a good study for the life cycle hypothesis issue. So I recommend you to think about the annuity product from the life cycle.
And financial
hypothesis.
planners don't prefer them too, right? Right, guys? I don't know. You have you that are working with clients. Do you prefer annuities?
That's like asking me if I prefer a hammer over a screwdriver in my toolbox.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on the job, really, because I could remove the wall plate, I could remove a light switch with the claw of a hammer. It would work. I could make it work, and I could hammer something with the end of a screwdriver, but they're two different tools for two different purposes. And so I think that they get a bad name because of Daniel's desired research, the compensation component of it, and how advisors are often, especially young advisors, are the incentives are misaligned to survive 5 years and you'll make it, build your practice on recurring revenue. But here's these other things that will pay you a lot up front right now so that you can survive 5 years. You just never get to that point of that inflection point where you can do the right thing all the time. And so you're constantly using a hammer on a screw. So that's why they get a bad name.
I would actually say the bias goes both directions as well, because I think fee only advisors don't use them enough. They tend to avoid them pretty militantly, both because of the perception, but also because of their own conflict of interest, which is a lot of good, well-structured annuity products don't pay or can't have fees charged on them. And so you do have both versions, right? You have somebody who's being driven by commissions to sell an unnecessary product, and you have fee-only advisors avoiding the use of valuable tools because they can't get paid to use them.
Yeah, I put in the chat, but like on this topic specifically, and it's kind of the grounds from which I use that idea of insurance being an asset class if you have a bequest motive, and annuities being something that has to be considered. But Wade Pfau and Moshe Milevsky are two researchers that have a foot in both door from academic and research, and they both have some really, really good stuff out there that it has good insight, in my opinion, anyway, from both the academic and the practitioner side on this specific thing. Not gonna lie, I got to meet Pfau like several years ago, and I kind of fanboyed a little because I had read all his stuff, and I would like use some of the concepts in training advisors and in my own practice. And so when I got to meet him, I was just like, would it be weird if we took a selfie, it's like at a concert or something as a teenage girl, and he's this super nerdy academic guy, and anyway.
And so Eric picked Brandon's question, and so how can the impatience be incorporated into the model that we learned today?
So impatience would cause more borrowing, more impulsive behavior and in spending more early on and rather than saving. at the younger age? Is that where we're, I don't know, because he was talking about young adults, right? Sorry, Daniel.
No,
go
you're
ahead.
good. I can see it the other way though.
But-
Like I view it through maybe my own lens too often, but like I'm impatient to retire. So I've arguably saved too much. Like I should have, in accordance with economic theory, I should have been maximizing better utility by spending more money earlier on in my career, as opposed to saving as much because I was impatient to retire.
So the
So it could- I-
definition of impatience is our very first, thing that we need to work on. How do we define impatience? Jen, and then-
And I think that
when
gets,
the-
oh, sorry, Effie, go ahead.
oh, no, go ahead, Todd, yeah.
I was going to say, and to Chet's point there, and impatience to retire, I think the extreme of that is the FIRE movement, right? Where it's like, I want to retire when I'm 28 years old, and therefore I'm going to wear a winter coat all, inside, so I don't have to put my heat above 57 degrees.
Yep.
So yeah, it's interesting that you have this movement out, which again is a lot of young people.
Yeah.
So Chad, why are you impatient to retire? Does that mean to you?
Why? Well, because I got a lot of mileage on this body and I am not going to live that long. So I want to be able to enjoy whatever retirement means before I kick off at my ripe old age of 60 or whatever. And it's funny because I used to joke in my 20s that, man, I'll be lucky to make it past 40. And now that I'm in my 40s, our perspective shifts, but I always have been, I've just saved and like, okay, I gotta make sure the family's okay. I'm going to retire. I want to retire at 50. That was the goal forever. And so we saved so much and I don't regret it, but there's definitely things, that we could have done differently when we were younger and instead of saving all this money, but by saving, it's allowed us to make other decisions. So when we say, when we talk about this impatience and we talk about this curve and, coincidentally or not coincidentally, I'm teaching about life cycle hypothesis this week in my undergrad class. But we talked about it today as just how many people's lives actually look like that curve versus, if I drew mine out with the consumption line, it's definitely not a straight line. It kind of went and then we made decisions and it went down to save money. And then it went up when we had, we bought a house and then it went up again, there's all these different points throughout it, the stages as the text in the paper we're talking about. But yeah, it's just interesting.
Technically speaking, the consumption smoothing does not mean that the consumption function is flat. It still has some up and downs, but it's not perfectly aligned with the current income, okay? So the absolute income hypothesis, the big difference between the absolute income hypothesis and the permanent income or life cycle income hypothesis is that absolute income hypothesis, consumption follows the current income, okay? So the current income, if is look like that, then the current consumption looks exactly or similarly, it's very close to the income at that point. It's less than the income, but still the pattern is very similar, right? But the life cycle hypothesis or permanent income hypothesis, they consider the income in the future. So it does not exactly follow the income at that moment. It considers the future income. So the consumption pattern is a little different from the current income graph. Okay, that's the key difference between these two. Considers the future. So if you look at the textbook again and see the formula, the absolute income hypothesis only has the Y1, the current income for the consumption or spending decision, but the life cycle hypothesis or the permanent income hypothesis, they have Y1 and Y2. So that means they consider the current income and the future income for the saving or borrowing or spending decision in this time period. Okay. And I will share my screen just to, so this is the chapter 4 graph, and see, this is the budget line between the consumption this time period and the consumption in the future. And the graph here shows different utility functions for depending on whether the individual is patient or not. Okay. So for example, those who are very patient, their utility function is around here. Okay. So that means that that means that they will spend less now and spend more in the future. Probably Chet is around here, right? He prefers,
yeah, this is your definition of you're in
yeah.
you're
He
patient.
prefers to consume in retirement rather than while he is working, right? So he's patient. He can wait until he retires and spend his time and money in the future, right? Those who are impatient, described in Brandon's question, the impatient young adult, something like that, they are probably positioned around here, right? So their time preference is around here. So they will spend much more right now and then will leave less for the future consumption. And one of the questions from, I think it's from Effie. So you mentioned about the hyperbolic discount function. So
Yeah.
in that case, the utility function is very steep beginning here. So it looks like this here, but in the hyperbolic discount function, the graph looked like this. Okay, very steep at the beginning. So the utility function will meet the budget line around here. Okay, because of the steep slope at the beginning of the utility function. That means that those who have hyperbolic utility function, they are more inclined to spend right now rather than in the future because of the shape of the utility function. That totally makes sense, right? So the hyperbolic discount function is not really separate from the life cycle hypothesis or intertemporal choice model. It's one of the form of different preference function, okay? Are you following me? Mm-hmm.
So it's a way for them to show that different types of preferences on the side of the consumer. Yeah.
They discounted the utility from the future very heavily. That means that they are more likely to spend right now because they do not value the future consumption as much as the current consumption.
So those are the impatient ones.
Yes.
Right.
Correct.
Okay.
So that's not totally separate from the contents that we learned today. It's just a part of that, but in the intertemporal choice model or even the consumer demand theory, we just call it as preference, but that there are much more issues that we can explore there. We can have very different assumptions, right?
A good research question that comes to mind now is like with this impatient and the hyperbolic versus the where Chet is sitting up on the left, right? It can also be something cultural, maybe that in different countries there's these things look different, and how the percentage of impatient people versus savers can be very different in different cultures. I guess I don't know. I was never like, I grow like even in my 20s thinking, oh, I need to save for retirement, or I need to, save all this money for my kids to have it after I die or anything like that. I was always like, I'm going to make more in the future. So I'm going to spend what I have now because I'm not going to be 25 again. I'm never going to be 25 again. I might as well, enjoy my 25 before I become 45. And then it's a completely different life. I don't know, completely different way of thinking. I didn't even do imagine I had a job in a huge company that was offering me a retirement plan, and I didn't want to do it at the beginning. Like that's how bad it was. that I had to forgo the matching for about a year before I convinced myself that, oh, I'm losing up on free money. I need to do that retirement plan, you know. Yeah. But that may have to do with, I don't know, the way I grew up and the culture and all of that. So
there have been a lot of interesting research about, so not specifically for the academic research, but there are a lot of economic discussions surrounding why Asians save a lot because the Asian countries, they have very high saving rates compared to the Western countries, and the economists, they delve into why, but everyone has different opinions. But so one of them is really so maybe I will ask you, so do you have any thoughts on it, why the Asian countries show the higher saving rates aggregately?
is it also because of the, yeah.
Right.
No, the socioeconomic system that is different, that it's not capitalism versus, you know, more of the controlled economy kind of, I don't know.
I don't know enough about, you know, Asian national retirement plans and whatnot, but for example, you know, I don't know if they have what we call defined benefit programs or pension programs in greater or lesser proportion, or if they have a higher proportion of what we classify as defined contribution plans or something to that effect. I mean, that would be a completely non-cultural but still significant reason for a difference in saving rates.
I would suspect that from a cultural standpoint, when we save in Western countries, we're saving largely for ourselves. Whereas I feel maybe in Eastern cultures, there's more of a familial, you know, a family aspect of, I'm saving not just for myself, but this is my legacy. This is for multiple generations. This is so I can take care of not me, but those that come after me, that might influence that as well.
Is it collectivism? How do they call it? Like the culture, that the different aspects of the culture. I think maybe collectivism versus individualism more in the Western. Dr. Lim, you can tell us, or Matt, tell us some more of what you think.
So yeah, so one of the interesting article that I read was about so they have really different developmental stages across the countries, and we adopted like social securities or employee benefits very late. So actually the individual household had to save by themselves because they do not have safety net at the time. So like 70s, 80s, there have been very high savings rate in Asian countries, I think. And the other perspective is also about like, it's very different view, but because of the higher debt the Asian countries have, they did not have rooms to spend much. And it's interpreted as the higher savings, interestingly. So that's another perspective. And there are a bunch of different regions bunch of different interpretations on why Asian countries have higher rates, higher saving rates, something like that. And so Matt shared an article with us. Can you briefly talk about it? Mm-hmm.
So this is like all the factors you mentioned, like 100% that I was looking at before, and this particular article is one that like sort of sparked the whole interest in like cultural and understanding things. So like they basically took like the aggregate saving rates per country and then looked at immigrants to like the United States to see like how different savings amounts changed based off like country of origin. And they found like, oh yeah, like 3 generations down of like immigration into the US, like they kept trends of their like actual savings rates from like their country of origin. And a lot of it was attributed to like you said, like the fact that originally the economic systems were developing, so they didn't have the safety net. So like a higher savings amount was just because you didn't have the expectation of other safety nets or all those things that you could take into. And then collectivism, the fact that you have to take care of your parents as well as your children and leave a legacy is also a part of it. And then there was also like, oh gosh, there's one more where it was like the risk aversion, particularly in Japan. Like Japanese people typically just put everything into a bank or a money market yielding like negative interest rates for some reason, and they don't invest anything. So like the risk aversion kind of comes into play as well in having higher savings amounts to like hedge against future risk, I suppose. So
But yeah, I wanted to say this aspect of, you know, how the economy is functioning, like in Greece, for example, for the longest time before the country almost went bankrupt and all the stuff happened, right? We have pensions, like government pensions. Everybody has a government pension, and everybody's expecting, or used to expect, not anymore, of course, because things have changed a lot in the past couple of decades, but at least when my parents were working in the 80s and 90s, when I was a kid, everybody was expecting they were going to be making more in retirement without having to change anything. Like the employees, like my parents were government employees, right? They were getting raises every year, and they were expecting that when they retire, they will be making more than what they make today from the government. So they didn't have to really save, you know, they never really had to consider, oh, we have to. And they used to get when they retired like an aggregate amount of, like, I don't know, used to be a big amount before everything went down and before they gambled with people's money, because that money was money that they were getting from the people, right? My parents were contributing that money to that government fund, and they were expecting, oh, we will get this amount when we retire, which we can, you know, pay off our debts or do whatever we want with that, pay off our students and kids education with that money, and then we can also have a really good life until we die, because that's how pensions work. And even your spouse and your kids may get part of your pension, and then, you know, everything changed, and then the pensions, they started paying them less and less and less, and it's just, things are different now. And I wonder how savings habits have changed too in my country because of all these changes. But
so the pension issue is actually very important, and we will, after the midterm, we will learn about the behavioral life cycle hypothesis. And it's really, really interesting to see how the expectation from the life cycle hypothesis and the behavioral life cycle hypothesis are different. And one thing is that, so based on the life cycle hypothesis, the saving rate should be same regardless of whether the retirement income is so they are, whether there exists pension or not. Okay, because people are rational, they already consider about their future income, future spending, and everything, every change that will be in the future. Okay, so if they have pensions, then they consider that and will make the savings. Without pension, they consider that and they will increase their personal savings. Okay, but the behavioral life cycle hypothesis has the opposite expectation, because people do not have self-control and they have different mental accounts. So without the pensions, the saving rate will be reduced. The total retirement saving will be reduced. That's the expectation from the behavioral life cycle hypothesis, which really incorporates the real life scenarios, right? So we will touch about those issues later, but I think we brought up really good issues today, even like the pensions. But the life cycle hypothesis, it doesn't matter whether there is pension or not, because people make rational decisions over savings and borrowing decisions. Okay. Eric, I think you picked one question. Do you have another one to discuss?
I mean, he had a couple questions sort of in one, and I just thought I'd bring those.
Okay,
both
so
up
you
for
like
discussion.
both questions from
It was
Brandon.
kind of, yeah, it was kind of just like, you know, do you have, as you were doing the readings, did you have any research questions that popped up? And then also the way that he had phrased those specifically seemed like it was regarding like delay of gratification. So I just thought like, how would you turn that into a variable, so to speak? And that's kind of what we talked about.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for your presentation. It was really helpful, and you can upload your presentation file on Canvas, so other students can study with your slides for the midterm, okay?
Okay. Do you
I
want to
have
do that
to
on
say, looking, oh, sorry.
where specifically, or maybe you can answer that after? Is that-
It is in the under the assignments, I think, and there is a presentation
Okay.
heading, so you can post it under the presentation one, so people
Okay.
can see that. Okay.
Cool.
Also, that's for each one of us that presents, right? To post our presentations under the same one.
Yes. So I will share the screen here. So it says under the assignments, and there is a presentation heading, and you can submit it to the presentation one for the first presentation, and you will have the second presentation and post it here. Okay, and everyone can download the slides here. Okay, so I just briefly wrap up the chapter 4. So from the chapter 3, we learned that the consumer demand theory in one time period, income, price, preference were the key factors, right? For the intertemporal model, very similarly, income and price and preference are the still key factors. But here, income is income, but we consider current income and the future income, right? And it can be interpreted as like a permanent income or the life cycle income as well, okay? When we consider both of them. And then after that, the price. So from the intertemporal model, the price, we can consider the inflation factor, okay? So when we consider inflation, when we expect there will be an inflation, that means that the future consumption will be expensive, right? So when we consider the inflation, maybe some people are more inclined to consume right now. Okay? We know that housing price will be increasing sharply next year. Then some of the people will be more inclined to buy house right now because it will be expensive in the future. Okay? That impacts to the current consumption, current borrowing, current saving behavior. Okay, the income price, and we just mentioned the time preference, right? So it's a preference between the current consumption and the future consumption. And so the income price, time preference are still very important factor for the intertemporal choice. And the interest rate also jump into the intertemporal choice. And the other one we did not really mention much is the life cycle. And the back end Hong's article touched that issue. The life cycle is an important factor for the saving, borrowing, and spending decision. Okay, so that's the key from the chapter 4. And Wednesday, we will learn about the famous life cycle hypothesis. Okay, so the life cycle hypothesis itself is very simple, but the way that it is written in the article is a little bit complicated. They have some economic functions, but be patient, okay? So we learned that the patience really makes the difference. So if you are being patient, maybe the utility from it could be very different. Okay, so be patient with the life cycle hypothesis reading. Okay, so thanks, and I will see you on Wednesday. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.